So if you've been in this industry long enough, you'll notice that there's a lot of APIs out there that basically act as a pay per use API. AWS does this all the time. OpenAI does this. And one thing I wanted to try learning for myself is how do I build out an API that's behind a paywall so that every time someone invokes the API, they're going to get charged maybe 1 cent per API request. So I'm going to walk you through real quick about what I have set up. I have a Next.js application here, and when I log in, it's going to use Auth0, which allows me to basically log in with my Google accounts. And after you log in, it basically gives your users the ability to subscribe to your API. So I'm using Stripe, which has this pricing table. I also have some nice documentation set up that people can kind of go through to figure out what endpoints they can hit. So in order for users to use my API, they need to first subscribe so I can kind of bill them at the end of the month for how much usage they used. And I'm gonna go ahead and say webdevcody@gmail.com. And so after I subscribe, that is going to create a Stripe customer and then also create a subscription between that customer and the product that I'm kind of selling. So to just kind of show you, the customer here is created and they are subscribed to that subscription. Let's go and click on this. Let's go and click on the subscription here. And as of right now, you'll see that this user has not used the API at all. Their usage is 0. Let's go back to the dashboard here and I'm going to go ahead and create a new API key. So I'm going to say a test key. Now, when you're building out a pay-per-use API, you want people to be able to create keys and roll keys and delete keys, right? So these are the keys that they're going to be using to hit your API, and your API is going to use that key to authenticate. And we're going to go back to the documentation here. Let's click on my API over here, and I'm going to scroll down to my one endpoint I have, and I'm going to select that API key that we created, and I'm going to click on test, and then we're going to go ahead and just pass in a prompt. What my API is doing is basically I'm taking Dolly and I'm just wrapping it with a custom stylistic approach. So for example, for my prompt, I can say a programmer at a keyboard and computer. And so I'm gonna go ahead and click test, and that's gonna take that key that I created and that's gonna send that over to my API. My API is gonna listen for the request, and once a request comes in, it's gonna go ahead and track that and update Stripe so I can keep track of how many usages I've done. So if I go ahead and click on this image over here, and that is the image that's generated. But the cool thing is, let's go back to subscriptions over here, and I'm gonna go ahead and just refresh this page, and you'll see that this customer actually has one quantity for that pay per use product. So at the end of the month, as my customers have used my custom API, I'm gonna go ahead and just send them an invoice, and that'll automatically charge their card based on the usage that they did. So if you guys are interested in seeing how I built this, I'm using Next.js for the front-end application. I'm using Auth0 for the authentication, and I'm using Zuplo, which is the sponsor of this video, for the API. Zuplo is an API gateway, which I'll kind of diagram out what exactly is an API gateway. It's more of an advanced topic, but it's good to understand. It provides you ways to basically add authentication on top of all your endpoints. You can add analytics, you can add rate limiting. And like you saw here, I add some type of metering so I can automatically invoke Stripe as my API requests are coming in. Now, one thing I like about Zuplo is that this is built basically with the edge in mind. So all of your API endpoints are going to run on the edge, meaning that your users are going to get a really fast response time, low latency, and it's really, really easy to kind of create new endpoints that you'll see in this video as I kind of walk you through all that. And then as you saw, this dev portal is all created by Zuplo, the ability to basically just create an endpoint. This automatically is going to add your API endpoint here where your users or clients can come in and start using your API directly using the pre-made documentation that you provide them, which I found really convenient because no one really likes writing documentation. So having anything that kind of understands your API and just creates documentation for you is super awesome. So I will say I learned a lot of new things using Zuplo, and I think this is a great learning experience for anyone else who might be getting into web development or trying to understand how to put a paywall in front of a custom API. I think it's a good tutorial, so be sure to stick around and watch through, and I'll have all the links for the code in the description below. Let's get started. So before we start diving into code, I do want to diagram out what exactly we're going to try to build. So the first thing we're going to need is a front-end application. In my case, I'm going to be using Next.js. I think it's a really great framework to build out applications. But what exactly do we need a web UI for? Well, we need to basically allow users to register or sign in. And once they've signed in, we're going to be showing them a Stripe pricing table here, which allows them to basically subscribe to your Stripe account, where we can basically monitor requests that are being used. Every time someone hits our API, we want to kind of track that. And then at some point, we can send them a bill at the end of the month for all the requests that they have used. All right, that's it for the Next.js application. Now, I do want to kind of show how this is going to integrate a little bit. So we do have to integrate with Stripe a little bit. And we are going to basically use the pricing table that we'll set up in Stripe to display it here. And then also when you subscribe, we're going to go ahead and store that user's email inside of Stripe, and that's going to act as our like subscription lookup table. Additionally, we are going to be using Auth0 for the authentication pieces, right? So when you want to register or sign in, we need to basically create accounts and store that in Auth0. Now, the reason we're doing this is because Zuplo has to authenticate with something, right? You can't just allow any user to hit your API. You need to have some type of access token to verify that the user is who they say they are. So Zuplo has really good integration with Auth0, and using the docs that I kind of showed, you don't have to do much work at all to have a paywall over your API. So once you have your users created in Auth0, you hooked it up with Zuplo, and everything will just kind of work. So that's the first step we're going to try to build together. And then later on, we'll come back and add a little bit additional functionality to our paywall API. And then ultimately, you're going to have your users, once they've set up an account with your Next.js application with Auth0, they can actually start generating API keys using Zuplo. A user is going to use the Zuplo dev portal for right now to generate their API keys, and they can also rotate those and delete them using this dev portal. And when I say API key, I mean like the authentication header that you put in your requests. You're going to be putting a Zuplo key inside of those requests, and then that's going to basically be authenticated. We're going to keep track of what user is making those requests so we can kind of monitor the usage. So this is an important one. I'm going to go ahead and put a line over here. I'll say every request is going to be monitor the requests and send to Stripe. Because again, we're trying to do a pay per use, right? So every time an API user hits your API, you want to monitor every request. We're going to send a request to Stripe to basically increment a counter. So at the end of the year, we can bill them based on how many they've used. So outside of monitoring every request, something that's really important when you're creating an API is have some form of rate limiting. Built into Zuplo, there is a form of rate limiting you can basically just put in front of your routes. And then you can have the rate limit kind of limit the request based on the user who's making the requests. So if you wanted every user to have maybe one request every minute, you could do that. It's super easy to get set up. So most of this looks like a lot of work, but honestly, a lot of this is just going through Auth0 and configuring a tenant, going through Zuplo, setting up a project. Some of the most tedious stuff we're going to be doing is this Next.js application, and setting up Stripe is going to be pretty easy as well. So the last thing we're going to be using is OpenAI Dolly, and we're going to kind of put a paywall in front of that because we want to generate custom image based on like a certain stylistic approach. We make the request to Dolly, and then we're going to send that back to the user so they can use the image as they need. But I do want to talk a little bit about Zuplo and why using Zuplo for an API gateway is actually a pretty powerful thing to do. So for larger companies, often they'll be doing like microservices, or they'll have a bunch of different APIs. So they'll have like an auth API, maybe they'll have like a customer API, they'll have like a products API, etc. And all these APIs are kind of managed by different teams of developers. And if you have a UI, like a browser, let's just go ahead and add a browser here. So a user loads up the browser. It can be kind of problematic because every API that browser is going to have to connect to, it's going to have to know where the API lives. It's going to have to know the different endpoints of those APIs. And then on top of that, all these APIs, they need to make sure they follow the same authentication patterns as your other APIs in your team. So one approach that larger companies will do is they'll actually use something called an API gateway, which helps abstract away where these APIs live from your consumers. So instead of your users directly connecting to these APIs, instead, they will talk to an API gateway, which is exactly what Zuplo is. Zuplo is an API gateway, right? So behind the scenes, you can configure your API gateway to talk to these different APIs as needed. And there's a lot of additional things you can do. It kind of acts like this giant middleware. So inside your API gateway, you can make sure you have uniform authentication. So basically before any and every request, you can make sure that there's a token set and that token is authenticated properly, versus before every single API would have to make sure they have that code set up properly and not potentially have security issues. You can also have a global level of rate limiting. Okay, so instead of all these services having to provide their own rate limiting, you can do that at the API gateway level. You can also have routing rules. You can also do various middlewares, right? Now, the cool thing about Zuplo is Zuplo has the ability to basically write API endpoints, right? So you can actually run code that runs on a Cloudflare worker on edge all across the globe. And so when a user tries to make a request to your endpoint, it's going to run at a very, very low latency on one of these Cloudflare workers. They also have support for other runtimes where that can actually be the thing that runs the code versus it having to hit your API. Also, there's caching built in this. Zuplo has a built-in caching mechanism which can make your load times really fast. If you wanted to potentially cache some products that come back from your product's API, you can use Zuplo's caching mechanism so that when users try to access certain products, instead of it having to go all the way to your product's API, it's going to hit that cache that's at your gateway level. Again, that's distributed across the edge, and that data will be returned. So that just touches on some of the main aspects of why an API gateway is very useful. So I know this is a lot of information, but I do think this is really good information that you should understand before you start building out the project. But I think at this point, we are good to start coding in VS Code. Let's just go ahead and set up a project and hit the ground running. So the first thing we're going to do is, I don't even have a project set up yet. I'm going to say npx create next app at latest. And then we want to go ahead and create one called Zuplo OpenAI paywall. And I will just go ahead and say yes to all the defaults. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just open up that project real quick. And now we have a Next.js application. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up authentication. Some things that we're going to be needing for authentication is we're going to need Auth0, auth-react. We're going to need Auth0, Next.js Auth0. And I think that should be it for Auth0. So let's just go ahead and install that. So now that we have that set up, let's just go ahead and make a new file called providers.ts. And we're going to make a client component here. So I'll say export function providers. And we want to just go ahead and return a fragment right now. But we are going to be using a Auth0 component called user provider. And we want to make sure that we wrap our entire application with this user provider so that we can actually get authentication hooks throughout our application. So we're going to take in the children here, and we're going to go ahead and type this with props with children. And then we're going to go ahead and render out children like this. Now we are getting a little error here because I did not name this TSX. Make sure if you are using React components, you need to add TSX there. So that should be good for right there. Now in our layout, what we want to do is we want to basically wrap all this code with that providers that we set up. So just go ahead and import that providers there, and I'll paste that down there. Now again, the reason we're doing this is so that all of our nested child components have access to various Auth0 hooks for authentication. Now, the next really important step is you have to basically create an API for Auth0. So I'm gonna go ahead and make a new directory here called API/auth, and then that's gonna be a dynamic endpoint. I'll do that, and I'll make a route.js here. Now I am gonna use JavaScript for this route because I don't think Auth0 provides a TypeScript equivalent. I'm sure there's an easy way to find it, but I'm going to paste in some code here. So basically, we're gonna create a handler that's pulled in from Auth0 Next.js Auth0. And we are going to allow this to basically set up the OAuth with some scopes. So we want to get the email address when people try to sign in because we're going to need that. And then other than that, we're going to have to provide an audience process.env, which I'll show you how to set up in just a bit. But I think that's all you really need for the API. Let's go back to our main page here. Now we still have like the default stuff that's generated when you start a Next.js project. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all this. So because we set up this API endpoint over here, I can just go ahead and make an A tag. And I'm going to go ahead and say /API/auth/login. And I'll just go ahead and say login over there. You also have the ability to log out as well. So I'm going to say log out. And we're going to make these dynamically show based on if you're logged in or logged out. Okay. So now that we have the ability to log in and log out, let's just go ahead and call some hooks over here so we can know if the user is actually authenticated. I am going to put use client at the top of this page to make it a little bit easier for us. And then inside of this, I'm going to say const user is equal to use user. Now this is a hook that's provided from OAuth Next.js/auth. And this gives you access to the user to know if you are actually logged in or not. You can also get access to a loading Boolean. So if I wanted to, I could potentially say if user is defined over here, I'm going to say if user is defined, then we're going to show a logout button. Otherwise, we'll show a login button. Second thing we could do is if this thing is still loading, I'll just go ahead and show like a loading ... for right now and make it be a little bit easier. So another thing we could do, if the user is logged in, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this in a fragment for right now. And we're going to go ahead and say welcome user.name. And that should also show a logout button. We're not going to worry about the styles just yet. It's going to look really rough until we come back and make it look good. But I just want the functionality to kind of work. So at this point, we have, I think, most of the Auth0 stuff set up, but in order to get this to work, we are going to have to set up some .env files. So I'm going to say .env local, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste in some environment variables. Some of these we have to go and actually create an account on Auth0 to get set up, but some other ones, these are just like some random generated IDs. So let's go over to Auth0 and let's go ahead and set up a tenant. I'm going to go ahead and say Zuplo OpenAI paywall. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an application. So let's just go ahead and do that. Let's just go ahead and say Zuplo OpenAI paywall. I'm just going to go ahead and pick this one. I don't think it matters too much. We can come back and change stuff. All right, so first thing is we need this client ID. So let's go ahead and grab that client ID. And we're going to go ahead and paste it right here. Now if I click settings, let's go and click on the domain here. We're going to need that domain for here for the Auth0 issuer base URL. In fact, I think I should add HTTPS here in front of this. And then there should be a client secret somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that client secret and I'll paste it in right there. So that's step one, getting your environment variable set up with your secrets and your configuration for Auth0. Now, the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to APIs over here and I want to create an API. So let's just go ahead and say create API. Again, I'll say Zuplo OpenAI paywall. Now for identifier, you can actually put like the real URL to your application. In this case, I'm just going to put api.example.com. You just need this to be able to like match up when you're hooking it up to Zuplo and some other places. So I'll just go ahead and say that, create. And then we're going to go to machine applications, make sure this looks like it's all set up and it looks good. I think we might be using this client ID at a later point when we hook into Zuplo's documentation. But I just want to have this set up so we can kind of hit the ground running when we need it. All right, so the last thing we want to do is go to settings here and let's scroll down. I'm going to go ahead and go to where it says allowed callback URLs. I'm going to put that localhost 3000 API auth callback. And I do believe for logout URLs, you can just go ahead and put your top level URL. I might be wrong about that. We'll have to see in a bit. Let's click save changes and let's go back to our application. And notice that we do see that login button on our application. Let's go ahead and click it. And we see the Auth0 login. So I'm going to go ahead and say continue with Google. And we're going to go ahead and click on one of my accounts. So now it's asking me, do I want to grant this application permission to access my email? I'm going to go ahead and say accept. And then that should redirect me back to my application. And then it says welcome. Now instead of saying name here, maybe we should do email. So it actually says welcome webdevcody@gmail.com. I think to get access to the name, you probably have to change your scopes a little bit. Like I think profile might be one. I don't remember off the top of my head, but email is good enough. We just want to know that we're logged in or not. And let's verify if we click log out, does this actually log us out? And it looks like it does. So now we have the ability to log in with Google, or if you want to set up a username and password type of login, you can do that. All right, so now if we go back to our diagram, remember, we are trying to get Stripe to display a pricing table here. Okay, we got the authentication going with Auth0. We're able to log in and register. That works great. And we can get the user's email after they log in, which we're going to be using for subscribing to the Stripe product. All right, so moving over to Stripe, the first thing we want to do is we want to set up a product. Okay, so if you go to the top search bar here and type product, you can find your product catalog and you can create a new product by going down here. I'll say add a product. And what we want to do is we're going to say API pay per use. You can name this whatever you want. You can describe it. You can add an image if you want to. But the thing that we care about is we want to have a recurring payment. And we're going to charge this API a usage of 1 cent per request. Now, what we want to do is we're going to click on more pricing options and we're going to click on a pricing model here. So we can actually click on this and we'll say usage based and we'll say per unit, and everything else I do believe we can just keep the same. So I'm going to go ahead and click next and then I will click add product. So now that we've created the product, let's just go ahead and click on this. And if you scroll down a little bit, there are 3 dots over here for this pricing section. We're going to click on this ... and we're going to click on create new pricing table. Stripe gives you a nice script that you can just kind of inject into your applications that gives you a pricing table like this. And you can kind of modify it to customize it as you want. But what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and just use that API pay per use over here. And then I'm going to click continue. And we're going to say don't show a confirmation page. We're just going to go ahead and tell this to redirect back to localhost 3000. Okay, go ahead and click finish. And after you've done that, you'll see that you get some script tags here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and copy these script tags and we're going to paste them right into our application. So let's go down here to main. And honestly, I'm just going to paste them right here. I don't know why I grabbed the 2, 3, 4. Let's delete those. But when you're using Next.js, you can actually import a script component like this. Go ahead and do that. And that's going to load in the Stripe pricing table JS that we're going to want to use when we're trying to display this. Now for this Stripe pricing table, what we want to do instead is we want to have a div here, and we want to dangerously set some HTML because we want to use that and get it on the page so that when this Stripe code loads, it can look for this Stripe pricing table and kind of overwrite it with the pricing table that we're going to need. Okay, so if we've done this correctly, we should be able to go back to our UI. And now we get a nice pricing table with the subscribe button here, which is pretty cool. So unfortunately, this thing is always going to display to the user. Like if I were to log out, it's still going to be displayed. So we want to dynamically show this only if you don't already have a subscription. Okay, so let's go back to the code a little bit, and we're going to write a function to basically figure out if we're subscribed or not. So inside of our app directory, let's make an actions.ts file. And what we want to do is we want to pull in the Stripe library and try to make a request to the Stripe API to figure out the user I'm currently logged in as, the webdevcody@gmail.com, do we have an active subscription? I'm going to go ahead and install Stripe. Okay, should be good there. And then I'm going to say use server because this is going to be our Next.js server action. I'm going to import Stripe like this. And then we're going to go ahead and create a Stripe object using this Stripe constructor. And we are going to need a Stripe secret key. So let's go ahead and remember to set that up. Let's go over here. And I'm going to go ahead and just put that in my .env local. Now where you get that is you go back to Stripe, you go to developers, and then you go to API keys. And secret key is over here. So if I click on reveal and go ahead and click it, that should copy it. And there you go. You can just paste that in there. And now we should be good to basically set up a server action that we can call to figure out if we are actually subscribed or not. So inside of this actions file, I'm going to say export async function get subscription action. And we want to take in an email. So just go ahead and let that take in an email like this. Now what we're going to do is we want to basically do a request to the Stripe API. I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this in a try catch. And we're going to go ahead and just get the customer based on the email. So I'm going to say await stripe.customers.list. And we're going to go ahead and say email and then limit of 1. Okay, so that should query Stripe, see if the customer exists. And if the customer data does not exist, we're going to go ahead and just throw an error or just return null in our case. Just return null. So at this point, we should know if the customer exists or not. So I'm going to say const subscription is equal to await Stripe subscriptions dot list. And same deal, we can go ahead and say limit 1, and we'll say customer is going to be set to customer data of 0 ID. So that'll get the subscription back, but there's a chance the subscription might not exist, right? So let's just go ahead and return null if there's no subscription. Maybe your client signed up, but then they canceled their subscription. So they might not have a subscription, right? So we're going to go ahead and just say return null there. And at the very end, we could just go ahead and return the subscription. And we're going to say subscription.data of index 0. I know it's a lot of code, but you're basically just making 2 API requests to Stripe to see if the customer exists and if they have a subscription. If they do, we return that. Otherwise, we're going to return null. So using that, let's just go ahead and say const subscription and set subscription. Okay, we'll say use state. Now we could just set this to the return type of. And now that we're going to use that server action here. So I'm going to say get server action. Go ahead and import that. If you guys aren't familiar with TypeScript, basically this is saying get the type of this function and then get the return type of that function, which is going to be that object that we're setting up down here. But basically this should be null if there isn't a subscription, or it'll be defined. So maybe in this welcome page, we could say if we don't have a subscription, then that's when we want to kind of like do all of this additional like script logic, right? We could dynamically show this if they do not have a subscription. All right, so let's test this out and see if this actually works. I'm going to go ahead and click on subscribe here. That should redirect us to a Stripe checkout page. And we're going to go ahead and type in webdevcody@gmail.com. Go ahead and type in some bogus information. Now I will state that the way I have this set up, you do have to make sure that the email that is typed in matches the email that you have set up with the user. So if you log into the next app with WebDevCody, you need to make sure that they type in the email here. There are ways to basically create a checkout with Stripe, and you can have this predefined with something. We won't cover that in this video. Just keep that in mind. You may have to actually do a custom checkout and then define the customer email. But let's go ahead and click subscribe, and that should hopefully subscribe us to Stripe, and we should get a user record that shows up for webdevcody@gmail.com. Now this Stripe thing shouldn't have shown up, so we'll have to come back and check that. But let's go over here. I'll type in users, or I guess you can type in customers, and notice that webdevcody actually showed up here. So we have successfully subscribed to that Stripe product. And now we can actually start tracking when we use that API in Stripe. Oh, the reason this is showing up is because I haven't even used the action. So I think what we should probably do is I could say use effect. And when this component is logged in, when the user is logged in, so after they've successfully authenticated, I'm going to say if there is no user, just return. But if there is a user, that's when we can call get subscription action. And we can go ahead and just call set subscription here when that result comes back. We also need to make sure we pass an email. So I'll say user.email here. And then I think user.email could potentially be undefined. So let's say if no user.email, return as well. So we are getting a little TypeScript error. And the reason because of this is that the return type of this function is actually a promise, but we want the value. So you're getting a nice crash course into TypeScript right now, but basically we want to wrap this with an awaited. You could clean this up a little bit. If you don't want all this code inside your page, you could potentially just like put it inside of your action here. And I could just go ahead and say export type subscription is equal to all of this. And then we're going to go back and just put subscription there. So it's a little bit cleaner, and I'm going to go ahead and put type in front of that. All right, so this is happy now. So if we go back to the UI, notice that it doesn't show up unless we are actually subscribed. And just to kind of verify that, you can go over here and I can delete this user. Okay, down here it's saying deleting the customer. And now the customer should be deleted. So just go ahead and verify this. If I go back to my dashboard and refresh the page, notice that that subscribe card pricing table comes back up. So let's just go ahead and subscribe one more time so we have like a real subscription going. All right, filled it out. Let's just go ahead and click subscribe. And there you go. All right, so now that we have Stripe set up, we have our Next.js set up with Auth0. Let's go ahead and create a Zuplo project. And I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of using Zuplo. But then we're probably going to use their Zoop feature to basically clone an existing project that has a lot of the stuff we're going to be needing to set up a paywall in front of an API. Let's go ahead and create a new project. I'll call it Zuplo OpenAI Paywall. Right now, I'm going to say do an empty project. I want to walk you through some of the main features of Zuplo, but we're going to try using that project we just set up. We're going to go ahead and just look at what Zuplo has to offer and kind of show you how easy it is to achieve some of that functionality if you need it. So when you first start up a Zuplo project, you're going to get a project structure like this. So you have the ability to look at some routes that you have. In our case, we don't have any routes. So let's just go ahead and add a route real quick. And notice here, this looks pretty familiar, right? These are just REST endpoints. I can go ahead and make a /testing route. That could be just testing something. And then you have the ability to set up policies, which we'll talk about in a second. You can set up CORS rules. And then down here is your request handler. So when someone hits your endpoint, what do you want this to do? You can have it forward the request to another endpoint. You can have it rewrite the URL to another endpoint. You can have it call a function. So for example, if I wanted to make a function inside of like my modules directory here, I can have it do that. I can have it redirect users to different UIs if I wanted to. You can run AWS Lambdas. If you have access to that Lambda here, you can just put your function name, put your access token, your secret access token, and you can call Lambda functions directly based on Zuplo's routing rules. So I want to kind of ease you into this because there's quite a lot of functionality. I'm going to go ahead and click on function, and notice that this is pointing to a hello world default function. So if I go ahead and just click on this, notice that it takes us to a handler. So this is what a Zuplo handler looks like. Basically, you get a Zuplo request object, you get a context object, you can do some logging inside your endpoints, and you can return some data to the request. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just go back here. I'm going to save this route. Just Command S, notice that it is saving. We can also test this route out. So if I go ahead and click on this route, I can click test. And then I can actually invoke this with some custom headers if I want to. You also have the URL here, so if you wanted to use Postman or curl or Thunder Client from VS Code, you can just copy this and hit it directly. Let's just go ahead and test this out and notice that we do get back that message that was defined in our custom endpoint. Now, I want to point out again, this is going to run on Edge. So when you actually deploy your Zuplo from the working copy to a production, it's going to basically deploy this function on Edge, which means that you have tons and tons and tons of different endpoints your users could potentially hit across the globe, which really reduces your latency and your wait time for requests. You could see the headers that were passed in, and you can also see the logs of what happened inside that request. So this is really nice when you're trying to create a new endpoint inside of Zuplo and you just want to like verify it. I typically go in here, I'll make a request, I'll check the logs, make sure everything worked. Pretty cool. But again, we have a real live URL. So I mean, you can just click on this URL here. Notice this is just a hosted API. You can actually hit it. You can see that what's up. Okay, so the second thing I want to point out is that in front of every route, you can actually add policies. This is something that's super powerful. It's basically like adding middleware with your Express.js application or middleware in Next.js. But this is provided by Zuplo. And if you wanted to basically, for example, require everyone to have OAuth authentication, you can do that. Let's just go ahead and click add policy and I'll show you. So they have a lot of preset things you can do for your policies. For example, if you do Auth0, you can actually verify that the JWT in the authentication header is a valid JWT token. You can hook that up to your Auth0 account using your client ID and your secret ID, etc. And that'll kind of authenticate the token for you. They have authentication with Clerk. If you scroll through here, they have various things like Cognito, JWTs. You can limit by IPs. Okay, so that's pretty cool if you needed to. So they have like A/B testing, which they have rate limiting. So if you want to limit how many times a person can hit your endpoints, that's pretty cool. You can limit how big the request size could be. So they have all these built-in policies. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are quite a lot, but you can just add them really easily in front of your routes to, for example, add authentication or rate limiting. I am going to test one out real quick. I'll just say rate limiting just for fun. So time window minutes, I'm going to go ahead and just say 1 and requests allowed will be 2 and limit by IP. So you can change this to limit by like your tokens if you want to, but for now I'll say IP. Go ahead and click add, and now I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now what this is going to do is once this is done refreshing and deploying, I can go ahead and test this. I'm going to invoke it once, invoke it again, invoke it a third time, and now I actually get a 4292 many requests response. Okay, so literally adding rate limiting in front of your APIs took less than 10 seconds to set up, which is pretty cool. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and just remove that policy because that's not what we want right now. So as you create these policies, they're gonna show up in your policies JSON file over here. So for example, that rate limiting one we just added got added here. So if you wanna modify that by hand, you can do that. Or if you wanna use their editor, you can do that. I'm gonna go ahead and just delete that for right now and save that. Now, the second thing that I'm going to show, which we're going to be using in this tutorial, is their dev portal. So as you're creating an API, they're going to automatically create a cool looking developer portal that outlines all of your API endpoints. I'm going to hide my face for 2 seconds, but this is the dev portal, right? So as you're creating API endpoints, these are automatically going to show up in your API. So right now we only have test something, but you can see that we have that git/testing endpoint, and someone can come into this documentation and they can test out your endpoints like this if they want to, which is really convenient. And this is like something that you're going to have to provide users when you actually set up a real paywall on an API. The second thing I'm going to point out is that they have the ability to hook into authentication services. So in our case, we are actually going to hook this up into Auth0, and it's going to ask them to log in. So we're going to need to set that up with our Auth0 account. So let's go to the docs and just read through here. Basically, we want to set up authentication, and we can go down and just basically check authentication yes. We're going to say we want Auth0, and then for authority, we can basically just take, I believe, this whole URL here, put that there with the slash. For client ID, let's grab this one and make sure this works. And then for audience, that is that hard-coded string that we kind of did. So let's just go ahead and Command S. That should save it. Now if we go back to our dev portal, I should be able to click on this sign in button, which is behind my name. And I do need to make sure I set up my account to have access to that. So let's make sure we configure this properly to go back to /docs. So let's go down here. I'm going to say this is going to go to my Zuplo app. I believe will be this URL right here. So let's just go ahead and copy that one in. Okay. And then also we're going to add it to here for logout URLs. I think these need to be comma separated maybe. And then finally for allow web origin, we're going to take that URL and we're going to go down here and just paste it in without the trailing slash and without the docs. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. And now when I click sign in, that should hopefully redirect us to Auth0, and we should be able to sign in using that same account that we signed in with our Next.js application. And there you have it. I am signed in with that same account. So if you look at the docs that are generated for you, there's some weird lorem ipsum here. You can actually modify that. If you go to your route, so if I click on testing and I go to JSON view, you can see that the description here is actually basically your OpenAI documentation is going to display for your route. So if I were to change this and say an endpoint to test out a simple Zuplo endpoint that runs on Edge, I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now if I go back to the docs here and refresh, you'll see that that change reflects after a couple of seconds. Okay, so you can kind of customize the docs, which is really powerful. And then again, the ability to kind of test out your API using your authenticated user here is actually really cool. Now, just to quickly go through some of the other features, you have the ability to do an API test console, so you can write tests over your endpoints if you wanted to. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but another thing is your live logs. So as people are hitting your API, it's going to show your logs there. So if I go back and just test on this documentation, notice that those logs pop up. So this is really good if you're just trying to test your API locally and just try to figure out what's going on. You get some nice analytics you can look at for how many requests are happening, some build statuses. So every time you save a file, it's basically going to redeploy your working copy. And then finally, you have your project settings where you can go and you can define environment variables, which we'll do in a little bit. You have access to your Zuplo API keys, etc. So at this point, I feel like I gave a pretty good overview of how you can kind of create a route. You can attach policies to the route. You can create Swagger documentation with OpenAI and have that displayed using Zuplo's dev portal here. You can set up authentication of the dev portal with Auth0 and other providers if you want to, and people can test your endpoints directly from this dev portal. So now that we covered how a basic Zuplo application can work, I'm going to go ahead and go to an existing example here called Money API example. I'm going to put this link in the description so you guys can find it. So this example project is also doing something very similar to what I'm showing you in this tutorial with like a paywall behind some type of API request. We'll walk you through how to set up the Stripe with the recurring monthly metered usage. But one thing I want to point out that's really cool about Zuplo projects is that they often have a button here called Deploy to Zuplo. If I click on this, this is going to basically create a complete Zuplo project for you that has everything that you'll need to get started. So I'm going to say Zuplo, OpenAI, Paywall 2. I think I already have one called Paywall, so I'm going to do Paywall 2. And I will do Zupit. So now after deploying that example application, we have a lot more endpoints. We have a lot more functionality. We have middlewares, we have functions. A lot of this stuff is just pre-made for us that we can use to build out that paywall API if we want to. So I am going to go to this dev portal. I'm going to reset this up with Auth0. So in order for this clone project to kind of work, we do have to set up a couple of environment variables. So I'm going to go over here and we're going to go ahead and just add a couple of new ones. So I'm going to do name Auth0 audience. We have ours set to this. We can go ahead and do that. Auth0 domain, which should be this one. I don't think we need the HTTPS in front of that. We'll need one called bucket URL. So let's just go ahead and grab this bucket URL here. Go back and say bucket URL. We'll say Z API key. So going down here, we have a Zuplo API key. I'm gonna go ahead and just copy this. And we're gonna go back and add that for Z API key. And we're gonna go ahead and check secret there. And then finally, we're going to say Stripe API key, which I'll grab that secret key right there. And I'll go ahead and paste that in. So now that we have that set up, we're going to actually use a pre-made React component that Zuplo can provide you if you're using React or Next.js, where it's going to connect to your Zuplo application. And it's going to use a lot of these management OAS JSON endpoints to basically allow your users in your application to create API keys, roll those API keys, etc. So I'm going to be pulling in a React API Key Manager component that we can use in our application. It looks just like this, which allows your users to basically create keys and delete them and roll them as needed. And they can use these keys to hit your paywall API as needed. Let's just go ahead and install this React API Key Manager. And inside of Tailwind, we'll go ahead and go to the global CSS here. And I'll just import that. Now to start using this, I'm going to go ahead and just make another provider here. I'm going to call it Zuplo provider.tsx. I'm going to paste in some code and I'll walk you through how this kind of works. So this is going to load in that API key manager component and also bring in the provider that they give you. And basically the way this provider works is you have to pass it in a token and it's going to connect to your Zuplo URL, which we need to set up. So let's go back to our .env file, and we're going to go ahead and add in our Zuplo URL for this project that we just set up. So let's go to get started here. And this is our Zuplo URL. And once we have this file set up, we can go ahead and go back to providers. And we're going to use that Zuplo provider here. And we're going to wrap our children. So this is going to take in a token. In order to get this working, you do have to pass in a token, which we're going to pass in from the constructor here. So I'm going to say token, and then this will be and token is a string. And then in our main layout, we have to pass in this token, right? But in order to get the token, we actually have to ask Auth0 if they can give us our token. So I'm going to say const session is equal to await get session. And I'll import that from this one, the Auth0 Next.js auth. I'm going to change this to an asynchronous function so we can actually do some React Server component code here. And then once we get the session, we can just go ahead and pass in the access token. And I do believe this could potentially be undefined. Undefined. So we'll do that. And yeah. So now that we have the provider set up, let's go to our main application here. If the user is set up and we have a subscription here, we're going to go ahead and just use this API key manager. And we're going to import that from React API key manager here. We're going to pass in a provider. We can basically bring in that context. Over here, we have a function called use Zuplo context. I'll just import that. So other than having a subscription, we also want to make sure this provider is set up. So I'll just do that. And now if we go back to our application, so I accidentally copied the wrong bucket URL here. Make sure that you do copy the right bucket URL. I think I copied like this instead of this one. So I set that up, and now I also made sure that my URL had a v1 suffix. And now basically if I go to my UI, and refresh, you'll see that it loads up this widget down here that says you have no API keys, right? So on my Next.js application, when people are authenticated and they're subscribed, I want them to be able to create API keys that they can use to hit my Zuplo API. Let's just go and say my example key, go ahead and submit this. And now we actually have an API key, which we can use. So I can copy it. We can go over here, we can roll it, we can delete it. So using that key, let's go back to the developer portal here, just to kind of show you how this works. So if I were to go here and click on my to-do list API, which I plan to change to hit OpenAI after this, notice that this exact same widget is also displayed here. So when you're authenticated, you can see whatever keys that this user has access to. But let's test this out using their Zuplo developer portal. I'm gonna go ahead and select that one key I have, and I'm gonna go ahead and click test. And then notice that that key is already put in the header here. If it's a Zuplo key, you'll see a ZPKA prefix. Let's just go ahead and click test, and notice that it was successful. I'm gonna go ahead and do it maybe 2 more times, just to show you that this code is all hooked up into Stripe. So as your Stripe customers are hitting your API, they're actually occurring some usage. So let's go to that Stripe customer and let's click on their subscription here. And let's scroll down a little bit, and you'll see that that usage has been updated in Stripe. So as your users are hitting your API using their Zuplo key, it's going to basically keep track of that usage. And then later at the end of the month, it's basically going to automatically charge their card based on how much they used. All right, so the last thing I wanted to do is I want to kind of put my own twist on this example project, and I wanted to hit OpenAI and maybe use the Dolly API to generate an image based on a certain style. So if I go to environment variables, let's go ahead and add one. I'll say make this a secret, say OpenAI key. Go ahead and save that. And now if I were to go to my routes, instead of having this to-do list application stuff, let's just go ahead and delete some of these. I'll delete that one. I'll delete this one. I want to modify this one, and I'm going to go ahead and say image. I'll say create image. And let's go to OpenAI. Instead of having to write my own custom function, I want to see if I can basically just invoke OpenAI using Zuplo's rewrite rules. So over here, we go to image and click on images down here. And they should give you an endpoint that you can potentially hit. So you want to do a post request to this endpoint. Okay, so let's go back to Zuplo. I'm going to keep it as URL rewrite, but then I'm going to basically hit that OpenAI endpoint here. Now, the second thing I want to do is I want to make a policy here so I can attach that OpenAI key inside my authorization header. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say add or set request headers. And then for name, I'm going to say authorization. And then for value, we'll do money sign ENV, and I'll say OpenAI key. And I'll also prefix this with bearer. Okay, so this should, if I understand this correctly, this should basically set that header, automatically attach my OpenAI key, and then rewrite my post request to this endpoint over here. Okay, so now that the policy is set, let's go back to the developer portal because we're going to have to use the Zuplo key to be able to invoke this. And I'm going to refresh because I think I deleted a lot of these routes. So we have a create image route now, and I can go ahead and select that key. I'm going to go ahead and test over here. We could also change the default data here if we wanted to, but let's just go ahead and click test. Let's just go ahead and paste in an example prompt here. And this is complaining a little bit because we didn't go back and like modify what the required fields are. All right, for right now, I'm going to go ahead and say like image object. And we're going to go up to schemas over here, and we're going to modify that to-do object with image object. We just want prompt, so I'm going to delete the other ones. All right, so now this is updated with the new documentation. I can go ahead and test. You should get that example prompt there, and I'm going to go ahead and click on test. So what's going on is I'm making a request to Zuplo. Zuplo is taking that key that I passed in the header. It's decoding it and making sure that I track the usage of the user who's attached to this key. And then it makes a rewrite to OpenAI. It attaches a header so that I can actually make the request with the proper permissions. And it gave us back a response. So if I were to go and look at the URL here, I should have an image of a mountain covered in snow. So the cool thing about this is that, again, this is all tracked in Stripe. So every time someone hits my API, I'm keeping track of how much usage they're using, and I can bill them. Now, this is a post request, so I don't think I can actually like modify the payload that's being rewritten. So if you wanted to have more custom functionality, you can rewrite this to be a function, and then you can use that function to basically invoke OpenAI using like a fetch request, and you can kind of stylize your prompt as needed so that your users aren't just basically calling OpenAI directly. You're adding some customization to it so that every image they try to create. So we should probably try to do that because I think that'd be pretty cool. Let's go ahead and click on a new handler here. And I'm going to go ahead and say request handler. And I'll say like OpenAI. And now we have our OpenAI function here. And what we're going to do instead is I'm going to go back to that routes. Click on this. I'm going to change this to be a function. And I want to select my OpenAI default function here. Okay, go ahead and save that. Then I'm going to open that file up. So what I want to do is I want someone to be able to do a post request to my endpoint. I'll say const prompt, and then I'll say equal await request.json. That'll give us the JSON that they sent in the post request. And we want to basically make a request to OpenAI. So I'm going to do await fetch. And we need to make sure we get that OpenAI endpoint, which I believe it was this one. I'll grab that. And then we're going to go ahead and paste in a body. I believe we have to like do a JSON stringify here. We'll say prompt. And we're going to go ahead and say, take in the user's prompt like this. But let's go ahead and add like a custom suffix here. So I'm going to say in the style of a South Park cartoon. Probably do method of post. Headers is content type application JSON. I always figured these things are actually like required, and then body would be that. And I'll say .then, we'll say response.json, and then we should get back the response. I could just return it, I think. So let's save this and let's see what happens if I were to go ahead and just invoke this again. So I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to grab this token so I can just use it directly in here because I think it would be a lot easier. And I'm going to go to routes, go here, I'll go to test, authorization, go ahead and paste that in. And then we should be able to say prompt, what image do we want? I'll say a kid snowboarding. Okay, so now we should do a post request to this endpoint. Hopefully, the endpoint will process that post request, make a custom prompt using the one I sent in. Well, we are getting an error saying you did not provide an API key. So let's go back to our handler because I did forget to pass in an authorization. So I'll say authorization. And then we want to get that bearer. And we're going to say environment. I think if you bring in environment here, you can go and say environment dot, and then we're going to say OpenAI key. Let's save this again, and let's go back and see if we can make that request again. So that should save the Zuplo key that we had because I have this checked here, and everything should be saved. Let's go ahead and test it again. This time it looks like it's doing something, so that's good. It should be kind of creating our dolly image using that kind of wrapped function. And let's go ahead and open this. And there's our character with a little bit of a South Park style. Not the best, obviously. This is obviously not the best, so let's just play around with this one more time. I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna add, instead of here, I'll say model, I'll say dolly 3. Go ahead and save that and let's try it one more time. Okay, so that created that one. Let's go over here. And here is our new and improved kid snowboarding. Now, obviously it doesn't really look like a South Park character, so dolly 3 can only take you so far. But hopefully you get the idea. I showed you how to basically make a custom handler that is going to do a fetch request from an edge location, and it's going to be super fast. So at this point, I might just do a little bit of refactoring to make this look a little bit nicer. So for example, it'd be nice if we had like a little header here. I can say header, and then we're going to say if we are authenticated, we could just go ahead and display maybe the username. I'll just put a div there, and then we'll have a button, and then delete that. And then if we're not authenticated, we're going to go ahead and just display like a div that says login. Now let's just get rid of the ternaries. I think it's just causing too much of a pain. So if we're not logged in, just show a login button. All right, delete that, delete that. This needs to be in a fragment probably. So the header itself, let's just go ahead and say like BG gray of 50. We could say padding of Y of this. Then we could put the whole thing in container maybe. In fact, we could actually take this and we could say container. We could wrap the whole header in a container. BG gray 50, padding Y of 2. Maybe we'll say text of black here. MX auto on the container to center it. And then we're also going to say flex justify between. And then we could probably put like a logo. So this will be like the links. So I'll put a div here. This could kind of represent our links. Over here could be like a logo. Zuplo API paywall. Something like that. And then also we'll say items center. Now for this, we'll probably do a class name of flex, gap that, item center, add more padding to the header. This looks pretty good. Now making the buttons look a little bit nicer, we could probably just say class name. We could say BG of pink. We could try to do like the Zuplo theme. Hover BG pink of 600. All right, we could say rounded, text to black. Probably give it some padding too. So padding X of 2, padding Y of 2. Maybe give the text to white. All right, so that's what the button looks like. The button a little bit more padding in the X direction. That looks pretty good. I think between these two components, I think these two things, we should put some gap. I think here the gap needs to be a little bit bigger. So for these things, let's just go ahead and just put a title here. So like I'll say H1, I'll say welcome to your API dashboard. And we're going to get rid of that. The class name of text for Excel, font bold. Here we go. And then for this, I don't like the justify between that's going on here, so I'm going to delete that. And then we'll just say gap of 8 between all these things. Maybe even gap of 12. I think having a link to the docs would be really useful. So I could say you can view the documentation here. And we're going to go ahead and wrap this like this. And then probably put a target equals blank. So it opens in a new tab. For this class name, we'll say text of pink. There we go. Takes you straight to the docs. And then if I log out, let's make sure this looks good when I log out. This has a login button here, not the best. And then the login button at the top in the header probably needs to be styled as well. So there we have a login button. Let's go ahead and add another H1 for when the user is not logged in. So I'm gonna go ahead and just like put this here. I'll just add a button that says login to start. I'm gonna keep this simple, okay? So some final things I want to talk about with Zuplo is that when you want to go live, when you want to deploy to production, you should hook this up to a GitHub repo. So if I click on this and say connect to repository, you can connect this to a GitHub repo, and then when you get your code merged to main, it's going to deploy all your changes to Edge, right? To their Edge runtime. Right now, when I'm coding, it's just doing like a local working copy. So you will want to connect this to a repo. Go ahead and say authorize Zuplo. Go ahead and add my GitHub account, I guess. And I only wanted to have access to one repository, which just create a repository. I'm going to say Zuplo API example. Okay. Now, hopefully, that should show up if I go over here. Say only select repositories, Zuplo API example. Go ahead and click install. All right, so now I gave Zuplo access to that one repository, and I should be able to find it here. Let's go ahead and say connect. And when you refresh the repo, notice that all of those Zuplo code is there. It's all been promoted to this. And it's also on main, so I do believe this is going to actually start deploying Zuplo, like I mentioned before, and it says your deployment is complete. Go ahead and click on this, and we have access to our API. If I click on this, notice that inside of here, you can click this drop down and you have working copy, which is basically where I've been doing most of the work in this video, but you also have your main environment. So this is the environment that you'd actually like want users to connect to. This is the URL, and you can also set up a custom URL as well if you set up a subscription to Zuplo, I believe. Now, I do want to mention there is a way to run Zuplo Gateway locally. Everything I've done in this tutorial has been using the built-in UI, but if you want to dive into more advanced stuff and be able to use VS Code like your normal workflow and have Zuplo Gateway running locally, just follow these documentations. They'll show you how to either create one from scratch, or if you want to go ahead and import an existing project, you just go ahead and set up the Zuplo CLI command. You can do a project update, you can install the NPM modules, and then you just go ahead and run your project, and you should be good to go. So now that I kind of got everything working, I do want to kind of circle back and talk about some of these functions that we just used from their example project, because I think understanding them is important. One thing I want to point out is if you go to the create image endpoint, you'll see this composite metered request, right? So there's ways to basically create policies, and those policies can be a chain of various other policies chained together, right? So first it's going to invoke API key inbound, which is going to check the Zuplo key, and then it's going to call a metered request policy, which basically is what's talking to Stripe and batching up requests and sending over to Stripe. Let's look at this create consumers TS. So basically when we created that key in our UI, and we're that widget that allows to like roll keys and delete keys, it's basically calling this create consumer function. And you're able to attach metadata to these keys that we're creating, right? So in our case, we're attaching an email, we're attaching a Stripe customer ID. So later on, when I invoke this endpoint, this v1 images endpoint, that actually looks at my key that I passed in, and I have access to some metadata. So for example, if I look at this metered request ES file, this is looking at that Stripe customer ID that's attached to the key. And then it basically verifies that, hey, is this key still valid? So like I mentioned, Zuplo has a built-in caching mechanism. You see here, it's creating a cache object here. And it's basically checking to see if the customer ID has already made a request to this endpoint, and it's just grabbing that subscription details from the cache. If it hasn't been seen, then it basically makes a request and it tries to cache that basically. So you can see down here, after it makes a request to get the subscription details, if they don't exist, we're going to go ahead and get those and put them in that Zuplo cache.put here based on the Stripe customer ID for 60 seconds. So again, in all of your API gateway endpoints, you can basically start utilizing a cache to make all your requests super fast and low latency if you need to. And a lot of these other functions are just kind of like helper functions that are used other places, like the Stripe service. That's kind of used to kind of talk to the Stripe API. Again, I'm not going to walk through all this code. Feel free to read through it if you want to kind of expand your knowledge. But that's the overall setup for how I got this project going. So that is about it. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, be sure to go check out Zuplo. Try it out. It has a lot of functionality for if you need an API gateway with rate limiting analytics authentication. You saw it with what I did in my video, but there's a lot more that you can kind of understand and read about if you go through their docs. Really cool product. I'm actually impressed with how many features it has, so definitely go check it out. And the links to Zuplo will be in the description below. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day and happy coding.